Welcome back to Theories of Knowledge, the first collaborative online course for arts and humanities doctoral students across Scotland, brought to you by the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities with support from the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Scottish Funding Council. Theories of Knowledge examines the ways in which philosophers and critical theorists have influenced and indeed continue to animate how we understand knowledge production within arts and humanities fields. The 10-week series is delivered live and online by leading researchers from the member institutions of the Scottish Graduate School. This evening, Dr. Stephen Greer will deliver the 5th lecture in our series, Performance and Performativity. Dr. Greer is lecturer in theatre practices at the University of Glasgow. He received his PhD from the University of Edinburgh and taught from 2008 to 2013 at Apparatus University. Dr. Greer's research and teaching are focused on the intersection of contemporary performance practices, cultural politics, and queer theory. He also writes about identity, interaction, and play in new media performance, including video games, which I'm excited to hear about, perhaps. He is author of Contemporary British Queer Performance, out from Palgrave in 2012, which offers a materialist genealogy of recent queer performance and argues for the significance of collaborative practices and non-traditional venues. Since 1999, he has regularly performed in and produced shows at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, most frequently as live producer and fixer for sketch comedy and theatre group The Penny Dreadfuls. He is currently developing a critical monograph on the cultural politics of solo performance. Today, Dr. Greer will unpack some of the more challenging and provocative claims surrounding the notion of performativity, arguing for its continuing usefulness as a mode of critical practice. If gender is, as Judith Butler puts it, a practice of improvisation within a scene of constraint, how might performance, on and off the stage, elaborate and challenge gender's possible terms? A quick note, as always, for those of you attending remotely this evening, we will take live questions and comments from our online forum following the lecture. Please log in to knowtheory.org, that's knowtheory.org, and navigate to the Performance and Performativity post in the discussion page. Without further ado, Dr. Greer, welcome.
Thank you. Okay, hello. Thank you very much for that introduction. What I'm going to try to do today is pull apart some of the connections and maybe distinctions between performance and performativity, and offer performativity as a kind of critical strategy for thinking about performance, but also our kind of culture at large. Though the title of this lecture is Performance and Performativity, I kind of came back to it today and realized the missing word there is gender. Clearly the work of Judith Butler is today's focus, so much of today's lecture is really about the particular quality of performance that constitutes the performativity of gender. In any case, what I'm going to do is start with some working definitions of performativity. These are going to be ambitious, broad-sounding, impossibly large definitions, which I'm then going to try and explain, elaborate, and probably contradict over the rest of the hour. So, if performance presumes the existence of an actor, performativity disputes the idea that there's an actor there at all, other than the actor created by the very act of acting. Performativity describes a process by which the given becomes given, that is, how we understand what is unremarkable, normal, and natural to be established. Beginning with a few simple gestures, it describes how our social reality and our bodies, as we take them for granted, acquire and retain the quality of permanence, of becoming a permanent and neutral surface on which culture and which politics then seem to act. It describes a process by which some bodies get produced as real and others are considered to be unreal or less than human or aberrant and less deserving of protection. It describes the fierce constraints that we encounter every day in the negotiation and maybe kind of public expression of our identities and the bodies we live in. At the same time, it describes the possibilities for improvisatory agency, which takes place even within that same structure of subjection. So though Butler argues that gender is this kind of mechanism of constraint, it constitutes a set of norms that we have to live within that define us as being normal or abnormal, it also describes this kind of locus, this territory of creative and productive activity. So that while gender performativity is inevitable, gender identity is something more open-ended and carries with it the seed of something which is open and incomplete. And it's this openness, this orientation on a horizon of possibility, which I think places Butler's work within the ongoing project of queer theory and queer theories and queer studies. So, in trying to explain some of those grand claims, I'm going to draw some ideas from 3 of Butler's major works. So, Gender Trouble, Bodies That Matter, and Undoing Gender. Now, Butler's work on performativity extends far beyond these texts, and I think has continued to develop in conversation with a number of different critics, some of whose work I'll address during today. Before turning to Butler, I want to spend a few moments, though, talking about the work of the language philosopher J.L. Austin. Now, J.L. Austin's work, I think, gives us a really useful structure for thinking about Butler's work. Austin isn't directly addressed in that first book, Bodies in Gender Trouble, although it does become a kind of explicit part of the debate in Butler's later work. I think it gives us a really useful place to think about her work and gives us some kind of conceptual ideas that we can then take forward. So Austin's analysis is first offered in a series of lectures at Harvard in the mid-1950s and later published as a book, How to Do Things with Words, which I think is a beautiful title for a book which everyone since then has been trying to match. It offers a distinction between 2 different kinds of language, and this is where it starts. So we have 2 kinds of language. The first is constative and the second is performative. So constative language is language which involves some kind of truth statement. So constative statements are either true or false, so we can come to some kind of collective agreement about whether they are true or false. So if I say today the sky is blue, we could go to the window, we could go outside and have a look and say, yes, we have come to the agreement, yes, it is Glasgow, and yes, the sky is blue, though that seems unlikely. The second kind is performatives, and these are statements in which speaking is or is part of the doing of an action. So it doesn't just describe reality or describe an action or an aspect of an action. The speech is the action or is part of the action itself. So Austin's phrasing is kind of deceptively simple. He says, the issuing of the utterance is the performing of an action. The issuing of an utterance is the performing of an action. So the most frequently cited example of this, and it's the one that Austin begins with, is the utterance "I do" in the context of a wedding ceremony. So it's speech which is an action. It's speech which makes the person who utters it into a married person. Yeah, it doesn't describe the fact that they are married. It enacts the marriage contract. Now, one of the first kind of consequences of this distinction that Austin starts to pull out is that performatives might not be subject to truth claims in the same way as constative statements, because the situation at hand is the performative statement itself. In any case, Austin tries to set out a number of conditions for performative speech. So these are conditions which will let you know or kind of guide whether the speech is successful, whether it achieves its action. In Austin's parlance, he talks to them about being happy or felicitous speech acts. So he says that performatives, to start with, rely on conventional procedures. So it's an established procedure that is known in advance, which is then performed by people in circumstances that are appropriate to that procedure. The procedure then has to be kind of taken and carried out by all of the participants correctly and completely, so you can't just leave bits out. And when that procedure is designed for a purpose which is about having true thoughts or feelings and expressing them, then the people involved actually do need to have those true thoughts and feelings. So that kind of rules out sarcasm in the event of a wedding. So, again, go back to the wedding ceremony. So the person saying, I do, only gets to become a married person if they say the phrase at the right moment during the ceremony. They can't just blurt it out. They have to wait until it's their turn. They need to say it in front of a person who's also legally entitled to be married to them. They need to be a person who is of the right gender for that jurisdiction, the right age. They need to be judged of the right mental state. They are in charge of their faculties and are capable of giving consent to marriage. And then the whole thing has to be witnessed. Someone has to write down that they've seen it. Those forms have to be witnessed again in the presence of other people, and that all has to be filed with an authority. It's incredibly romantic when you think about it. So, really specific, highly contingent, contextual rules which apply to the Speech Act. Of the Performative Speech Act. Now, but as kind of Austin's lectures continues, he starts to blur the distinction between the constative and the performative. And as James Loxley notes, who's got a really beautiful book on performativity, he starts to draw attention to statements whose constative truth involves performative felicity, and statements whose performative felicity seems to involve some aspect of constative truth. So the lines become muddied, become blurred. And he starts to make some other distinctions, and he comes up with a slightly more complex framework. He talks about locution as the kind of semantic contents of speech, and then he has two other dimensions, the illocutionary and the perlocutionary. So very, very briefly, the illocutionary dimension of speech describes the act that is attempted or accomplished, and the perlocutionary dimension is the effect produced by saying something. So it's the kind of consequences or effects of speech. Now, my focus today is primarily Butler, so I'm not going to go much further into Austin's theory, but I do want to kind of highlight two aspects of his thinking that I've just kind of tried to suggest, which seem particularly helpful to us when we approach Butler's work. So the first is this recognition that performative speech is highly contingent and circumstantial, constrained in advance by the intelligibility of the ritual ceremonies on which they depend and in which they invoke. Yeah? Marriage works because we know what a marriage ceremony is supposed to look like. Yeah? The rules of it have been set down for us, literally in the case of marriage, as a legal contract. Second, and this is maybe more consequential, performative utterances are kind of exposed to trouble because they are conventional. Loxley says they are ritual ceremonial performances which invoke characteristics which do not belong to them alone. So speech is always haunted by this possibility of failure. Not only that speech might misfire and not acquire its intended effect, but it might bring with it other unexpected plural effects. You might do more than you meant to do with a moment of speech, because speech is continually citational. It always involves and invokes words other than the ones you have said. So one of the areas of my research has been concerned with the emergence of, I guess, a consciously identified gay and lesbian theatre in the UK in the early 1970s, and thinking about its relationship to a nascent gay rights movement in the UK. And in that body of work, there's this repeated emphasis on the importance of coming out as a kind of individual and a collective act of determination. This is something that you have a responsibility to do for yourself as a gay person, and that the community collectively has a responsibility to do. I think one of the ways I've been approaching this, the examples of this, both in performance and activism, is to see how the status of coming out seems to register as both a constative claim, this is a truth about my sexuality I'm revealing, but also a performative claim which asserts and establishes the gay or lesbian or bisexual person as a kind of socially intelligible figure. There's a play by a company called Gay Sweatshop, it's kind of the UK's first gay and lesbian theatre company, a play called Mr. X, and the play's titular character, Mr. X, is presented as this figure who has no interest and no need for gay liberation, but towards the end of the play he has this transformational moment and decides to come out. And he steps towards the front of the stage and delivers this speech, but in that moment the theatrical event slides into something else, because the actor playing the part at that moment gives his own name and address. So you have this collision of the theatrical event of coming out being secured or underwritten by the presence of a real-world biography and a real-world body presenting and confirming this language. And I'm interested in there how one seems to speak to the other. Does the body authorize the speech, or does the speech perform the body that we see before us? So in any case, I think we really want to attend to something like coming out as a really troublesome and highly contextual kind of speech, which is always laced with the possibility of failure, even though it's emphasized as a necessary act which produces and stabilizes a gay community. People may misheard the statement of coming out, though. They might mishear the statement of coming out. It might be misunderstood. It might be disbelieved. You might have the claim refused. People might think you're joking. You might come out without intending to. Coming out also extends beyond the simple contents of speech. So the theatre historian Alan Sinfield notes this advice that Noel Coward gives to Cecil Beaton in 1929 on looking or sounding queer. So it's advice on how to protect yourself. Quote, "I take ruthless stock of myself in the mirror before going out. A polo jumper or unfortunate tie exposes one to danger." We don't tend to think of coming out in terms of unfortunate ties. But there is something interesting about that, the unstable signification of the tie as an act of coming out. What are you performing with your choice of clothes today? Did I dress straight? Did I dress gay? Which are my gay trousers? One also might want to think about this, the stability of this kind of coming out act as a performative, which is a negotiation with the public sphere, with the social sphere. So maybe it's an attempt to kind of secure the terms of your identity against the precarity or the risk of suddenly being exposed. So you assert a form of self-determination, I name myself. But coming out still is a form of speech, a form of performance, which unfolds in time and space and doesn't necessarily leave a reliable trace. So the queer legal theorist Janet Halley observes that even the most forthright gay man or lesbian cannot come out once and for all in a single public disclosure. As she moves from one social setting to another, she'll have to come out afresh or acquiesce in assignment of her to a non-referential public identity. So in other words, you go into another room. Do you have to come out again in that room, or are you once more closeted if the default presumed setting is straightness? So if you were to come out, for example, during a public lecture being streamed to a certain number of institutions across Scotland, but the connection were to drop at one particular awkward moment, then suddenly we have an interesting example about how knowledge gets made and how knowledge gets circulated, and maybe about how speech gets recognised as knowledge at all. So in his discussion of speech acts, to go back to Austin briefly, he refers to the etiolation of speech. And this is a word which is normally kind of in botany, and it means to enfeeble or deprive of natural vigour. So it's kind of weakened speech. And the example he gives of this is theatrical speech, such as that, quote, a performative utterance will be in a peculiar way hollow or void as if said by an actor on the stage. I think that's like a 1-star review at best. But void and hollow speech is theatrical speech. I think, though, we might think about situations in which the hollowness of theatrical speech is intended or is a desirable outcome. So theatre scholar Helen Freshwater draws on Austin's Performative to read the dynamic of marriage equality protests led by the pressure group Outrage during the 1990s, and in particular the staging of mass queer weddings in Trafalgar Square in 1991. So Freshwater suggests it's the failure of these performances of marriage to enact actual marriages, which is the site of a kind of productive critique. It shows it's the selective recognition of certain relationships, certain people in certain contexts, which is unjust. So it's the failure there which is useful to us. Judith Butler's account of performativity, though, takes us beyond speech acts to address the materiality of the body and of the gendered body in ways I think have to challenge a number of what are commonsensical beliefs about both gender and sex. So, I'm going to move towards Butler's work, and this is really where I'll spend the rest of my time. And in the original preface to Gender Trouble, this book written in 1990, Butler positions her work as an intervention within the field of feminist politics at that moment, which attempts to trouble the dominance of a binary framework for thinking about gender. In the preface to the kind of expanded 1999 edition, Butler clarifies, the work is intended to criticise what she perceived at the time as a pervasive heterosexual assumption in feminist literary theory, that restricted the meaning of gender to received notions of masculinity and femininity. I think at the heart of Butler's writing is a kind of ethical project, one which is central to much of the field of queer scholarly inquiry, one which attempts to expand the range of lives which are livable and qualify as fully human. In Butler's case, it's to do with shifting a sense of gender from being proscriptive to being descriptive of possibility. It's an ethical project, I think, which recognises that there are very serious and violent sanctions that can face subjects whose bodies and lives do not or cannot conform to presumed categories for gender. And it's the failure of our failure of our ability to approximate or fulfil those expectations which somehow speaks to our failure to be human. In any case, Gender Trouble begins in its challenge to the usefulness of an analytical distinction between sex and gender that emerges in second-wave feminist politics. So it's a distinction between notions of sex as referring to biology, the given material body on one hand, and gender as cultural beliefs and practices which apply to such bodies. So we're thinking about here the inflection between male-female and masculine-feminine. So this thinking is part, I think, of a broad kind of feminist interrogation of women's lives, but also more broadly of gender essentialism. So the idea that there are kind of fixed categories of gender, and then there are fixed characteristics which are defined as being like women's essence or men's essence, and then those qualities are common by all such people who fall into those categories. So we have these really fixed, permanent characteristics and social functions which are organized in a kind of binary relationship, such as the definition of being a woman is that you are not a man, and the definition of being a man is that you are not a woman, yeah, this binary opposition. So we have, I think, a few kind of points of reference here as we kind of go outside of the frame maybe of Butler's work and think about the broader field of feminist scholarship, though the person who Butler engages with directly is Kristeva. I think is Julia Kristeva. I think a lot of the thinking that she is drawing on comes people like the work of Helen Sixou. So her work offers this kind of critique of opposition, particularly of the opposition of man and woman, and she kind of places that opposition in the context of a larger series of, I guess, associations, kind of patriarchal hierarchies of values, and she provides this analysis where she kind of says the feminine side is always figured as being negative and weaker, the kind of less powerful instance. In any case, while the distinction between sex and gender does allow us to kind of advance certain critiques, so it allows us to maybe challenge fixed and kind of homogenizing roles for men and women by recognizing that men can have conventionally feminine aspects and that women can have conventionally masculine qualities, that thinking only takes us so far. The problem with that thinking is that it still remains the kind of product and function of a binary system of thought, which ultimately still retains this opposition between male and female, and kind of assumes also this mimetic relationship between gender and sex. So it kind of retains as a kind of ghost of its procedure that there are still real men out there who look like real men. Yeah, there's this mimetic, the mimetic logic of the word is iconicity. Things look like what they are. So the radical proposal that Butler offers to us is that we might want to think about gender as the apparatus by which sex is produced. So gender is not merely the cultural interpretation of sex or the rules which apply to differently sexed bodies, but the discursive means through which sex is produced and established as the somehow pre-discursive neutral surface on which culture then later acts. So accordingly, Butler's argument is that our acts, our gestures and desires produce the effect of an internal core of substance which we then take to be sex, which we then recognize as sex. Such acts, gestures, enactments, generally construed, writes Butler, are performative in the sense that the essence or identity of what they purport to express are fabrications manufactured and sustained through corporeal signs and other discursive means. So not only is sex always already gender, but the gender itself has no ontological status, no status as a subject, apart from the acts that compose it. Okay, now I just jumped through a huge number of claims there, so let's take a second to walk back through some of them. The first claim is the idea that we have no natural body which exists before culture and discourse. The idea is that we can only know sex through gender, and although we become our genders, there is no place which is somehow outside of gender which precedes this becoming. Sex is always already gender because our understanding of sex is always constructed through discourse. It's always constructed through culture. So even if we concede there is some quality of the material body that we think we can refer to without reference to cultural construction, let's say chromosomes, Butler observes that such a concession nonetheless takes place through discourse and is formative of the very thing that it concedes. We might think of a parallel line of argument. It's slightly different, but it's helpful. It's been helpful to me. It goes something like this. Even though we might look down a microscope and observe some kind of distinct difference between two different kinds of cells, we come to an agreement as a laboratory that there are differences between those cells. As soon as we try and apply meaning to that difference and start to invent policies about what such difference should cause us to do as a culture, suddenly we're back into the realm of discourse again. As soon as we try and attribute meaning to that minimal difference, something else starts to happen, and we've shifted from a constative observation into a performative, discursive enactment of values. Now, in arguing that discourse is formative of the body, Butler does not claim that it originates, causes, or exhaustively composes the body. Rather, the point is that we don't have pure access to the body in a way that doesn't involve a discursive claim. So when it comes to the matter of bodies, the constative claim is always to some degree performative. So Butler's account doesn't erase the material body, but rather asks us to consider the processes and terms by which the body acquires its materiality, and maybe ask us to understand why some bodies are seemingly less material. Why do they fail the test of being properly male or properly female? Big quotation marks around those phrases. So if we describe performativity as a process by which the gendered subject is constructed, that construction is not a single act or a straightforwardly causal process. It is instead what she describes as a reiterative process. So it's something that takes place in and across time. Gender acquires its naturalized effect through the sedimentation of that process. It builds up in layers and stabilizes to produce the image of sex. Gender is perhaps a particular set of habits which we take on and we occupy on a daily basis. So if we've got the expression gender fluid to recognise people whose sense of gender is something other than categorically fixed, perhaps we can also invoke the phrase gender congealed to suggest the stickiness of our gender habits. I don't know why more people aren't using the phrase gender congealed. I think I've invented it. It's a very regrettable phrase, I will admit. But it does give us some sense of the way in which, well, as I said, habit is sticky, the way it builds up through association, perhaps through proximity. Anyway, here's Butler again in what is perhaps one of the most often quoted sections from Gender Trouble. So she says, gender ought not to be construed as a stable identity or a locus of identity from which various acts follow. Rather, gender is an identity tenuously constituted in time, instituted in an exterior space through a stylized repetition of acts. The effect of gender is produced through the stylization of the body and hence must be understood as the mundane way in which bodily gestures, movements and styles of various kinds constitute the illusion of an abiding gendered self. So I've kind of pulled out there, added this emphasis, with this temporal quality of what Butler's trying to draw out, that the body is not a given inert thing, it's something which is done. The gendered body is a practice constituted in time, the repetition of acts, and in particular, the stylized repetition of acts. I'll come back to the question of gender and style in a moment. Now, this account of performativity has sometimes been read to suggest a kind of open-ended and wholly improvisational quality to gender, so that I can be whatever I choose to perform, and I can stop or start my gender performances and have whichever gender I choose simply by exerting control over my kind of social presence, my social presentation. So Elspeth Probyn, for example, has noted that such celebration and appropriation of Butler's work has concluded that we can have whatever type of gender that we want, and there are as many different genders as there are people. Now, Butler has kind of responded to this really optimistic, but slightly, I think, misleading account of her work on a number of different occasions. And her argument is that performativity consists in a reiteration of norms which precede, constrain, and exceed the performer, in the sense that, and in that sense, cannot be taken as the fabrication of the performer's will or choice. In other words, it's not a matter of free will or self-determination, because we're dealing with a kind of a cultural apparatus which is there before us, before we are born. Sarah Sali offers some further clarity. She writes, Butler is not suggesting that the subject is free to choose which gender she or he is going to enact. The script, if you like, is always determined within this regulatory frame, and the subject has a limited number of costumes from which to make the constrained choice of gender style. I'm going to return to the question of agency in a moment, but for now it's helpful to recall our understanding of a performative utterance as having a ritual quality, as having a conventional quality which is known or is legible in advance of its utterance. So Butler's emphasis is placed on a stylized repetition of acts here and a stylization of the body. Understood in this way, gender appears as an effect of citations or corporeal quotations of the standards for gender which come before us, which are already in cultural circulation before we are born, before our embodiment of them, before we are taught them, before we internalize them. We can recognize them easily at any given moment. We can think of these standards as norms, both in the sense of this kind of culturally and historically specific rules about what it is to be male or to be female, but also standards for normalization which govern our very social intelligibility as subjects. So here, following maybe Foucault, we have a sense of sex as a regulatory ideal, a kind of organizing principle for our performance of gender. So this is something we're always trying to reach. We're always trying to attain being male or being female, but we always fall short because it is an ideal. At the beginning of this talk, I suggested that I was interested in performativity as a strategy for reading about performance. I'm reading performance. I'm equally interested, if not more interested, in exploring how performance might inform theory and push back against it, how the material specificity of performance might inform our understanding of this really contingent quality of performativity as it appears in Butler's account. So an example. There's a play, John Tiffany's production of Blackwatch, played by Gregory Burke. Staged by National Theatre Scotland, it's toured internationally. Some of you may have seen it at one point or another. It's a play which is based on interviews conducted by Burke with former soldiers who served in Iraq, and the play kind of attempts to tell the story of the conflict and of the history of the legendary kind of Blackwatch regiment in the War on Terror through the eyes of the men on the ground of the conflict. So there's a sequence in about the first third of the play in which the play's central character, Cammy, narrates the history of the regiment through Culloden, the American War of Independence, through the Boer War, the First and Second World Wars, up to Iraq. And as he speaks, a red carpet is pulled out across the stage, and the other soldiers begin to maneuver him in and out of the distinctive uniforms of the regiment's history. But the history of military masculinity that unfolds, staged, as you can see there on as though they're on a catwalk of a fashion show, involves more than just the dressing of costume. It involves a particular stylized performance of a body, the drilling and maneuvering of a body which seems to be producing the body as a thing capable of fulfilling a particular purpose. The male masculine military body is being made. Burkes Script notes, they resemble a squad assembling and disassembling a military cannon. Gender emerges as something which is done rather than which one merely has, something which has a history that extends beyond the persistence of our individual bodies, but also perhaps requires our bodies in order to be sustained and continued through the present moment. Yet if gender is something which we do rather than something which we have, the terms of that doing are not exclusively in our hands either. In Blackwatch, figuratively, literally, it's in the hands of others. The performativity of gender has an eluctably social dimension. Butler suggests one does not do one's gender alone. One is always doing with or for another, even if the other is only imaginary. Another example of a different kind of performance. Rosanna Cade's work, Walking Holding. So this is an experiential work which takes place outside of theatre venues and takes place in the streets, and it involves one audience member at a time, walking through the city, holding hands with a range of different people through a carefully designed route. So the performers or hand holders within the piece are intended to reflect a range of different people with different genders, sexualities, ages and races, disabled and non-disabled people. Initially staged in Glasgow, Cade has taken the work around the UK and Europe, and it's been to Hong Kong, and I think it's touring again. It will be staged again this summer. So my experience of the work, I was taken onto the busy main concourse of Glasgow Central Station. I was told to shut my eyes for 10 seconds, and then when my eyes were open again, everything that happened would be the performance. So I did as I was told, and a kind of pleasant-looking older woman walked up to me, and I said, "Would you like to take my hand and we can take a walk together?" And I did. And we walked, and we talked. She said we can walk in silence if we want to, but we did chat. I can't remember what we talked about. But as we passed a shop window, and it was a shop selling men's formal wear, which I remember because there was a man in a shop dummy with a man in a kilt, we stopped and we looked at the clothes in the window, and we looked at our reflection in the window, and then we could also see what other people saw of us as they were walking by in the street. And we had this lovely moment of being able to see the various different versions. I was trying to work out what we looked like. How big enough was the gap between our ages? Did this look like friends? We were holding hands. Was this mother and son? Was this some other kind of relationship? After a short distance of conversation, I was passed to another person, as though in a relay race, this time to a very tall English drag queen, and the pace of our walking changed because cobbled streets are not kind to high-heel boots. I was passed to another person and to another person until I finished the work walking through a shopping centre with an older man, older than my father, slightly frail, and needing some support to walk with confidence. So though the work is really about a discovery of intimacy with strangers in public spaces, an encounter with people who may be like or unlike yourself, it also seems to be about how one's social presentation might shift in proximity and attachment to other bodies and may be transformed by that proximity. If nothing else, the experience drew my attention to the normally unmarked defaults of the otherwise everyday performance of my gendered self and my ethnicity and my sexuality, a labour which is largely invisible because it's so incorporated into the work of being Stephen. Let's return to an earlier point in the argument, though. So to argue that the gendered body is performative is to assert that it has no ontological status apart from the various acts which constitute its reality. So the idea that there is no doer behind the deed, the person who does the performance is the performance. When we make that argument, it's not the same as arguing that a subject is wholly determined by the act of performance, where determination forecloses the possibility of agency. Butler observes that performative practices are not founding acts in the sense of creating a subject once and for all, but are instead a form of regulated process, a form of repetition and reiteration, as I've suggested, in which we perform these terms which give us these culturally intelligible terms for gender over and over again. So we don't do being male or female once, we do it over and over again, partly because we're compelled to perform it over and over again, because we know we face sanctions when we do not approximate the norms of gender which are expected of us. It's in that structure of repetition, though, that the possibility for agency appears. So I suggested that we might think about sex as a regulatory ideal, something which we might only approximate. And it's because that we always fail at it that a space of agency opens up. So to the extent that gender involves the citation of an ideal, which we cannot wholly embody, gender is always constituted in failure, and in that failure we have the possibility of doing something other than gender in its most normative instance. I'll try and explain that a bit. Moyer Lloyd suggests that Butler's claim on the possibility of agency involves three linked claims. First, that one can never embody the ideal of male or female, and thus gender is constituted by and through failure. Second, that the repetition that constitutes gender is always representation with a difference. You always never quite hit the mark and you never repeat yourself, and therefore gender is always inherently unstable and incomplete. And that the necessity of the repetition creates a space for transformation. So while gendering is a compulsory practice, it's an assignment that is never quite carried out to expectation. Though individual agency might be limited to forms of improvisation within a scene of constraint, this circuitous path of citation, repetition, and reiteration demonstrates a kind of integral failure in that mechanism. Butler argues, norms are continually haunted by their own inefficacy, hence the anxious repeated attempts to install and augment their jurisdiction. What Butler is arguing then is that we might understand the dependency of norms on reiterative processes as a function of their inefficacy, their weakness. They are not established singularly, once and for all. They are not permanent truths, but have to be repeatedly renewed. And that dependency on reiteration suddenly describes a weakness in the norm that might be occupied and exploited to alternative ends. Such a practice of resignification describes a form of agency which is not wholly voluntary, though. It's a form of agency which is implicated in the relationships of power that it's trying to contest, but it's not reducible to the terms of that power. That's an abstract thought, though. What might the working of a weakness in the norm look like? So we turn, as all performance studies lectures eventually must, to the question of drag. So, Butler first turns to consider the possibilities of drag. In Gender Trouble, she draws on the work of anthropologist Esther Newton, who has a study of female impersonation, this beautiful book called Mother Camp. And what Butler suggests is that drag offers an imitation of gender that exposes the structure of gender as imitation. So drag cites gender norms in a way which exposes their citational status. In the words of David Ruffalo, drag is a notable example of how identity is a parody. It is not a copy of an original, but a copy of the illusion of an original. Drag is a copy of a copy. How does drag work this magical effect? It does so, Butler suggests, by drawing our attention to three dissonant dimensions of our significant corporeal presence. The difference between our anatomical sex, I'll say that again. It does so by drawing our attention to the dissonant relationship between three contingent dimensions of the drag performer: anatomical sex, gender identity, and gender performance. So as much as drag might work to produce a coherent picture, and this is maybe where we have a problem with drag, that it seeks to approximate a potentially misogynistic ideal of femininity, the distinctiveness of the aspects that it's trying to pull together demonstrates this false process of naturalization. In other words, the cross-matching of an anatomy, a gender, and a gender performance draws our attention to the aspects of, let's say, femininity, which are normally taken to be the natural expressions of womanliness, and suddenly we get to see them afresh as performance. Drag dramatizes the cultural mechanism by which sex and gender are made to appear unified. In imitating gender, drag implicitly reveals the imitative structure of gender itself, as well as its contingency. Now, not all drag might accomplish this effect, and Butler returns to explaining in Bodies That Matter that drag is not an exemplary example of performativity, only one possible example. So Butler's discussion through Bodies That Matter, I think, is also focused on a very particular kind of drag in a very particular context. So she reads the documentary Paris is Burning, which is concerned with drag balls in New York City, which is staged and attended primarily by African American and Latino men. And they are events in which realness, quote unquote, describes a successful production of a naturalized effect, an effect which requires the embodiment and realization of particular norms marked by race and class. This is, I think, one of the significant developments of Butler's argument in Bodies That Matter, is that she tries to address how regulatory regimes beyond normative heterosexuality might shape and regulate the subject. In particular, she makes the argument that racial differences should not be somehow seen as subordinate to sexual differences. In this account, Butler makes plain that there is no necessary relationship between drag and subversion, observing that drag may well be used in the service of denaturalization, but it's also quite capable of re-idealizing hyperbolic heterosexual gender norms. Drag is more than capable of being misogynist and capable of being racist. Given that it participates in the circulation of the dominant images of our culture, maybe that should be no great surprise. Though all gender might be parodic in the sense of quoting, not all parody is subversive. Drag, then, is a form of performance which is capable of subversion to the extent that it reflects the mundane and everyday impersonations by which these ideal genders are performed, and the extent to which it undermines their power by virtue of exposing that process. So we might want to think of that exposure in terms of theatricalization. So an exposure which draws attention to an act's quality as an act. Drag may also be useful to an understanding of performativity, though, because it is a site of ambivalence, one which Butler suggests reflects the more general situation of being implicated in the regimes with which one is constituted, and the degree to which we are kind of implicated in regimes of power we might very much want to critique or resist. We cannot simply stop doing gender, not at least without significant consequences, and consequences which might constitute violence to ourselves. So we're kind of caught in the trap, and that drag presents a heightened rendition of that caughtness, that trappedness. There are, though, other problems which remain. The act of kind of crossing gender, from going from masculine to feminine, or across sexuality from straight to gay, may well operate by first kind of accepting the coherence and validity of those categories in the first place as the basis of an account of identity. We might also want to think about the problematic structure of parody as quotation. So we know when something is parodied because we are familiar with the original, yeah? That you don't recognize a parody unless you know there's something being poked fun at. So in order for a parody to work, you need to retain and invoke the idea of an original. So parody might actually have something other than its intended effect. It might work in the exact opposite direction to the one that might be radical. So, I mean, I think the other note there is that subversive parodies might well easily be reincorporated and, I guess, domesticated as forms of entertainment. And there are frequently forms of entertainment which reinforce rather than challenge the distinctions between male and female or between straight and gay. So, I mean, the two examples in my head, quite different examples, which speak to British and American traditions, to think about the normative qualities of a thing like Mrs. Brown's Boys. A BBC sitcom with a central character is a drag performance, a man presenting himself as an older woman. We might also think about the very distinct and different normative politics of a show like RuPaul's Drag Race, which in many respects is radical, but also has its own very strict rules about which forms of drag are celebrated and which are not. So, a route through and beyond such reasoning, though, might be offered by the work of Jose Esteban Munez, and his writing cuts across issues of sexuality, race, and queerness. And he tries to argue that there are, I guess, forms of performativity that might go beyond individualistic rebellion and to open up, I guess, spaces for social transformation. And he proposes a strategy of what he calls disidentification. And this operates as a mode of recycling and rethinking established meanings. It's a process which, quote, scrambles and restructures the encoded message of a cultural text in a fashion that both exposes the message's universalizing and exclusionary machinations and recircuits its workings to account for, include, and empower minority identities and identifications. I'm really interested in Munez's account because it describes a form of performativity which involves the incorporation rather than simple resistance or rejection of dominant cultural forms. So it takes them on, it takes on these toxic elements of our culture in order to challenge and rework and rewrite their closed terms. It's a process that recognizes perhaps that we are attached to some of those toxic elements of our culture and that stopping doing them isn't an option because they're part of how we're built. They're part of how we get up and function every day. So up until this point, my account of performativity has emphasized what might be called its paranoid capacities. That is, following the work of E. Sedgwick, a form of critique which places its faith in the exposure of hidden patterns of hegemonic social relationships, and a process which turns on the enlightenment of an audience who were previously unaware of these hidden meanings. Munez's work is valuable because it suggests the reparative potential of performativity, a means of discovering and creating new communities of identification, resistance, survival, and, I think, pleasure. Okay, I'm going to move towards the end. So Butler is a prolific writer, and I really only broached the surface of her work on performativity. I would strongly recommend Excitable Speech, her work on hate speech, as well as Precarious Life and Frames of War as works which kind of articulate and expand different elements of her thinking in different contexts. One of the more expansive dimensions in Butler's thinking has, I think, been in relationship to claims on universality, or the idea of universality. So as she observes in the extended preface to the most recent version of Gender Trouble, she initially conceives of universality in kind of exclusively negative or exclusionary terms. In more recent writing, though, she considers how the assertion of universality might be performative in the sense of conjuring a reality that does not yet exist. So it's a future-oriented labour which is directed towards an open-ended category for what might constitute human existence. And again, this seems to run in close concert with various other queer thinkers, particularly Munez, who frames kind of queerness as an ideality, something which is on the horizon. There's a great appeal to that idea, but it's also, for me, slightly problematic, particularly if you are attempting to be queer here and now. The horizon is always in the distance. Butler's ongoing engagement with the call for civil rights for trans and non-binary gender people is also a kind of further and significant element of her work, and one in which she has addressed certain misconceptions of her writing, particularly the idea that arguing for the constructiveness of gender might be to claim that certain genders are not real and therefore invalid. So I can really strongly recommend the interview with a trans advocate, which I think there's a link to on the reading list for this, or the suggested reading for this lecture, in which Butler asserts that the distinction between having having a sense of one's gender as either fixed or fluid is actually far less important than the ability to live out that sense of one's gender without discrimination, without harassment, without injury, without criminalisation, and with full institutional and community support. A few final thoughts. Mick Mangan, another theatre scholar, observes that social performativity and theatrical performance may be congruent, they may be related, and they may resemble each other, but they are not identical. He writes, evidence from past plays and performances has a complex and problematic status. It exists not as raw socio-historical documentation or data, but as the trace of a performed moment which was itself part of the complex dialectic between the real and the imaginary. Given Butler's arguments, we might dispute that we have any access to any kind of raw data at all on terms which are not already embedded in discourse. Nonetheless, Mangan continues, the stage operates as a separate space, subject to its own laws, and also as an extension of the everyday. It is a place where the performances of everyday life are themselves re-performed and, in the process, changed. It embodies a defined set of cultural practices which are marked off from everyday social reality, while claiming, at the same time, important forms of continuities between theatrical representations and that everyday reality. I think we might particularly see this tension at work in forms of socially and politically engaged performance that draws on documentary and verbatim material in the attempt to give the voice to the voiceless, in the attempt to challenge existing histories by contributing new ones, or in the attempt to reopen and restage old trials in pursuit of newer, better justice. Though such works often make a claim on the presence of authentic testimony, they also draw attention to the ways in which such speech must be theatricalized and interpolated within particular cultural conventions for it to be recognized as testimony, that is, for it to stand as capable of witness to something more than itself. In simple terms, we need the artifice of the stage to persuade us that something is real. Thinking about performance and performativity then involves the attempt to come to terms with this paradox and maybe other paradoxes running alongside it, and also find ways to exploit that thinking in ways that might open up new fields of knowledge about what it is to be human. The terms of that exploitation, though, the terms of that subversive opportunity, cannot be easily anticipated or determined in advance, and might therefore themselves might need to be continually open to the possibility of transformation. I'll stop there. Thank you.
We'll open first to questions from the room, and then I will take some questions from our remote participants.
Cool.
But begin with you.
One thing that interests me in looking at the history of performance in particular is that, of course, in Western culture we had an era where boys were often used as a substitute for women, for various reasons of historical taboos on allowing women to be public in that particular guise. I wonder if you could comment a bit on the extent to which that infantilization or that crossing of roles relates to youth versus age, because that's something which I don't think you commented so much, but which strikes me as significant in certain cultural contexts, even to the extent that in certain traditions, such as Western classical music, we are even willing to mutilate boys to keep their voices to sound like women in adulthood.
Can I repeat to some extent?
Okay, yeah. So the query was I suppose about historical practices of gender performance, noticing, I guess, on the Jacobean Elizabethan stage we have the presence of boy actors playing the parts of women, and to what degree that maybe says something about how we understand the relationship between youth and age. Is that fair?
And it's interesting how this concept of the idealized.
Oh, and how that relates to kind of the
fantasization.
I don't know that I have much to say about the idea of infantilization. I guess I'm really conscious of the kind of what those kind of conventions say about the historically contingent standard for what makes up genders. I always recall the kind of the practice of breeching, which persisted for up until really historically recent process, where infants are kind of kept in the same clothes up until the age of like 8 or 10 or 12 in some places, and then the boy children are like, right, you are literally being put in trousers and now you are a man. And I love the kind of the deliberate artifice of that, but also how seriously it was taken. There is a ritual quality that no one is blinking at. So I think that there's the tension between the old and the young is not something that I'm not particularly conscious of that I could speak to be completely honest. But in terms of theatrical practices of the idea of having boy actors playing female parts or the parts of women, Elizabethan Jacobean theatre is not particularly my area of research. I think one of the things that we have to be difficult about is applying our sensibilities, our reading practices to the audience there and then, of assuming that we know how they saw or read those bodies on stage. The degree to which that performance was non-illusionistic, I think, is something that we have to pay really close attention to. That naturalism and realism, as we understand it now, is an incredibly historically recent invention. And that say what you like about Shakespeare or Webster, these are not naturalistic dramas. So I think there is a rather different logic of maybe gender signification that's at work. But as I say, this is the point where I wish my colleague Vicky Price, who's a brilliant scholar about era of work, was with me today.
Mine's a sort of historical aspect as well. But you touched a little bit on race. I'm interested in the colonial period, and it's just got me thinking about the way that people were sort of regendered in a colonial context. So you would have women being, say, converted to Christianity and being clothed in a particular way, or being given different activities. Men were the ones who sewed, and then the colonial people came, and suddenly it's the women who do that because that fits in the gender role. I'm just quite interested in the way that performance is forced into a change, and the sort of intercultural aspect to it as well.
Okay, so the idea that the kind of the Colonial Project, the kind of the gender distribution of roles is kind of only one aspect of a whole series of different kind of, I guess, a politics of racination of kind of making your otherness acceptable. We make your not whiteness acceptable because we can re-engineer it within an existing set of about kind of the dominant culture's gender roles. Is that the?
Yeah, I suppose that it's giving. I'm not sure I'm articulating it very well because I'm just trying to think it through.
Yeah.
But it's just this whole raft of things that were changed, and the way that gender is understood across different cultures, and how that is performed, and how you can maybe you fail to meet the expectations of gender because you've got different cultural understandings, and they can't understand one another. And so how are you failing, and how are you actually managing to achieve gender?
Okay. So the kind of intelligibility of gender might have like quite literal geographic borders to it. That if you move into a different cultural space, you might find yourself failing at gender, even though you're not doing your gender any differently than you were 10 minutes ago. Or alternatively, in the case of the Colonial Project, people might turn up with guns and boats to tell you you've been doing your gender wrong all your life. I think one of the interesting things about one of the things that I would want to pay attention to in thinking about the performativity of gender in relationship to kind of colonial and post-colonial critiques is how sometimes that gender is a very small corner of what's going on actually, or gender is a convenient mask or structure through which other things are being accomplished. That what looks like a manipulation of gender is actually to do with controlling and putting in place relationships of class and authority, for example. It's about configuring a racial difference as a class difference, and that gender is just perhaps a convenient means of doing that, because gender allows us to, let's say, split up certain kinds of labour as belonging to certain kinds of bodies. So that though it looks like gender and is about gender, the structures that are being produced by it are actually about money and power, perhaps. And no, it's an interesting question. Thank you.
I have a question, actually, about performance, and I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how your critical work and your stage work relate to one another, just as a practical question, because I know that one of the things that a lot of us have been kind of thinking about over the last few weeks is that relationship between kind of practice and the theory that we're talking about. In this case, it's a particularly interesting, I think, relationship.
Okay. Before I apply any kind of complex theoretical argument, I should explain that the shows that I've most frequently made at the Fringe have been very, very stupid comedies. Which is not to say they don't have politics in them, but they're very stupid, very funny, enjoyable comedies. For me, and maybe I think in different ways for different members of the group I've worked with, one of the interesting questions has been about gender, because comedy certainly as it appears on the circuit is male dominated as a profession, and the executive producer for the Penny Dreadfuls is Idil Sukan, and she and I kind of staged the show together, and the rest of the team are all male identifying. We're all cisgendered men, and one of the things I think that we kind of happened on almost as a strategy through the performance, it was really through the guys writing actually, was that you kind of take advantage of the maleness of your performance. that not paying attention to it is actually a really, not only is it a cop-out, it misses the opportunity for some really good jokes. So the first years of the show was a sketch show set in Victorian England. And so much of it was about the ridiculousness of of male roles in and outside of the home, and of kind of the way in which patriarchal expectations might lead you to do incredibly ludicrous things on the battlefield, because that's what was expected of you. So I don't think any of the three guys, Tom Tuck, David Reed, and Humphrey Kerr, would describe whoever would describe their work as kind of being a fierce commentary on gender, but it couldn't help but be, because it was about Victorian men for a very long time. So my role as a producer sometimes was kind of in offering feedback and kind of helping the show be developed. I mean, a lot of my work is just very pragmatic. It's about stopping disasters from hitting the edge of the stage. Was kind of encouraging them to take that further, to kind of exploit that, and not. Because I think it becomes problematic when you assume that the male perspective in comedy is a default setting. Or it becomes much less interesting for an audience when you assume that your perspective is a default setting.
I don't know if you know anything about this, but I was thinking about maybe the construction of gender in relationship to the digitalized age, and maybe how, I don't know, it's more of an open question. Do you think that maybe people, if we were talking about video games, for example, do you think that maybe video games you want to construct some sort of online, like gender, like which is not used, which is out of the body, or what do you think?
I think there is absolutely the potential for people to use online spaces and video game spaces to create alternatively gendered versions of their identity. I am, though, really conscious that a huge segment of video game culture is dominated by the most kind of archetypally conventional representations of male masculinity and female femininity. There is a toxic thread that runs through the middle of an otherwise fantastic culture of people who are funny and generous and kind to each other. So I'm always a little bit cautious about there is a kind of utopian potential, I think, of people being able to invent digital versions of themselves, but you don't have to hang out for very long on Twitter as a woman with an opinion, for example, to discover that it isn't quite so much a space of enlightened debate as a horrific den of iniquity. So I think the potentiality of that is there, and I think that absolutely the capacity for people to form communities of identification which extend beyond their geographic location is really, really important. So that if you are a queer person who lives anywhere but a heavily urban centre, actually your access to other queer people might well be through digital means. So yeah, I mean, I can talk about individual examples of video games which are really, really interesting and do seem to be speaking in varying degrees about a queer experience. But I'm however much those works are becoming more common, they are an outlier, I think. And I say that as a huge fan of those games, but looking at the broader scale of things, yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about these games?
Okay.
I'm just curious.
There's a game I can recommend for you called Gone Home, and it's a game which takes the form of you play a college-aged young woman, and you come home to discover that to the family house, and that everyone is out, the house is deserted, and the main mechanic of the game is you trying to work out where everyone has gone, and you kind of explore the space of the house, like uncovering letters and books and answer phone messages. And it's primarily exploratory, and sometimes there's material which is like there in the game, so you actually read letters, and there are some instances where you trigger sound recording, so you have this kind of diegetic and non-diegetic information being given to you, but you hear voice acting as well. And as the performance goes on, you kind of have as the game is played, you realise that there's a little bit of a kind of crisis in the family, like your father who's an author is kind of struggling to write well. But what the central thread of the story is that your younger sister seems to have been in a relationship with another young woman, and so you start to unravel this very difficult relationship that this young woman is having with herself, and this form of disclosure that she's struggling with both publicly, but also to herself through kind of the letters that she's writing. So in many ways, it's a game which kind of frustrates all of the expectations of the first-person game. You know, there's no guns, there's no running, there are no enemies. There's a beautifully dismissive review of the game which was put up online, which said this is, there's no guns, no enemies. This is in effect a lesbian scavenger hunt, which I thought was amazing, and also accidentally complimentary. But it's a game in which, rather than shooting stuff, you're drawn to pick up objects and turn them over, and there's a real tactile quality to the exploration in the game, which I think is really interesting. But though it becomes kind of very clear that this is about a young woman having her first kind of same-sex relationship and coming to terms with it, although I was slightly awkward phrase because it suggests that some kind of terrible burden that she's coming to terms with, but she's recognizing, she's understanding what it is dealt with so obliquely, and that it requires you as a player to do the work of putting these elements together. It's a game which requires, I think, it places a burden of emotional intelligence on you to kind of reconstruct the emotional lives of this family, of which, as the player, you are supposed to be a member, but of which you have become slightly slightly divorced because you've been away at college all year. So that's a really lovely game. That is a kind of quite an indie game. It's a kind of niche game. You could also look at mass market games, though. Look at things like games like Dragon Age, where there's the possibility of it's a kind of sword and board kind of game. You're fighting with magic, fighting dragons, hundreds of people dead during the course of 30 or 40 hours of play. But you can get married. You can get married to a whole range of different people of different species. Your gender presentation and opposite sex, opposite gender partners as well. And that's a mass market game, hundreds of $1 million budget. But there are opportunities for that play seem to be emerging there as well. So there's a particular company called BioWare who I think are particularly well known for producing games which have interesting and adult in all kinds of ways content in them.
That's wonderful, thank you. I was just dying of curiosity. I do have a question from the board, which remains in the visual a little bit. This is from a student of art history. And the question is this: can you speak to the use of gendered and biological analogies in critical discourse, and how this might relate to Butler's theory of performativity? She's citing a long tradition in art history of discussing works, movements, entire bodies of work in gendered terms. And I think that the biological aspect is particularly interesting to me, because you do talk about things in biological analogies.
Yeah, and it's I think I'm trying to think what the term is. I was reading some more of her Butler's work this afternoon. There's, I guess, there's a few thoughts that occur to me. One of which is a kind of caginess around the idea of what we might call strategic essentialism. You might have come across this idea in the work of Gayatri Spivak. So this idea that sometimes for the purposes of reaching a particular goal, that you will come together under a kind of a banner of uniformity. Yeah, you will strategically essentialize yourself in order to accomplish particular goals. I think that there is a kind of sometimes a strategic essentialism which takes place in critical studies, where it is more convenient, it is easier to kind of apply biologistic kind of determinations of sex and gender, because it's a hell of a lot easier than wading into the weeds of queer theory and performativity. So it's a little bit of a kind of sometimes a default setting that goes, hey, look, we're cool, we're liberal critics, we're cool, but for the sake of just getting through this damn article in under 50,000 words, I'm going to default to these standard settings. So there is a kind of, I don't know how, it's a strategic essentialism which isn't as politically innovating as, or sorry, not politically invigorating as Spivak would suggest. This is a kind of laziness, perhaps. That's the first thing that springs to mind, perhaps. The other thing, the other kind of dimension to this, like, again, it doesn't speak directly to kind of art history, but I think it's the fact that our scholarship reflects broader trends in what we think liberalism looks like. So, for example, even though we do have, since the kind of early 1990s, this kind of body of queer theory and radical feminist thought and other elements of gender studies which make these increasingly interesting and consequential claims about not essentializing the body, about recognizing a whole range of different gendered and fleshed people which are fully human, you then look at the activities of a mainstream group like Stonewall, who continue to make very straightforwardly biologistic claims about sexuality. Yeah, the discourse of you are born this way. Yeah, that gay people just are. They just exist. The idea that gayness isn't in some way culturally constructed is put aside, because to get into that debate opens up a whole can of worms, and then suddenly they're trying to defend that gay people are worthy of protection. What you have instead is a discourse which does this strategically essentializing gesture of kind of going, particularly in relationship to gay young people, to kind of young queer people, young kind of lesbian, bisexual and gay people, is to go, they just are. So you have the slogan, some people are gay, get over it. They just are gay, get over it. We can't even talk about it. We can't talk about how their gayness comes about, get over it. Move on, move on. I need to talk, get over it. And it's a generous gesture, yeah. It's supposed to be like it's rhetoric which is directed towards people who can't come to the terms with the fact that there might be not straight people out there. Yeah, that's the intended rhetoric of it. But it also places sexuality. It places this idea somehow out of reach of examination. So it becomes and that is seen as a liberalising gesture, which I think is a really interesting political term, which I think is then reflected in our contemporary scholarship. We think that's what liberalism looks like.
Also, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like it also goes back to that conflation of kind of sexual orientation, the body, and gender identity, that those kind of all fall together in this, in this way of talking. And that, is that just comfortable? I mean, is it easy?
Yeah, well, I mean,
it's lazy?
I think it's totally functional. It's totally tactical. If you are trying to win public support, if you are trying to persuade a potentially hostile government, or you're trying to get funders to come on board with you, and the result is whether you do or don't have money to help people who are at risk, then yeah, you behave tactically, perhaps. So maybe I'm picking, the idea that I might grumble about what Stonewall is doing. It's like, get over yourself, Stephen. The fact that Stonewall isn't doing the radical queer work of Jack Halberstam, whatever. It's like, well, that's not what, they're not interested in that. They've never been interested in that. But yeah, it's tidy and it's convenient, but it's the tidiness of it which is troublesome. And it's also, I mean, that's part of a kind of broader critique that comes out of queer studies and in my own writing of the centrality of things like marriage, but that takes us along a different route from the subject of today's lecture.
You've already talked about this idea of societal norms and how they influence people, but I wonder if you could perhaps elaborate on how these norms may vary within the society, depending on certain roles that a person might take. I'm thinking in particular about, for example, occupation. So perhaps it is considered more standard for, say, someone working in theatre or someone working in an artistic profession to one, be gay, and two, be openly gay, than, say, someone who works perhaps as a church minister, to give a really extreme example, perhaps, or that you can think there are certain occupations where it seems taboo to discuss sexuality openly, or perhaps where it's considered more taboo to keep of a non-normative status.
Okay, so the questions, just for the sake of the people elsewhere, it was about whether the degree to which norms vary in relationship to different social roles, and particularly different occupations. So the kind of example being that if you work in the arts, if you work in the theatre, it's therefore more it's more acceptable to be gay, or you're likely to encounter more gay people, as opposed to if you were a minister or if you worked on an oil rig or something, or some other kind of suitably butch profession. It was really weird when you try and describe, obviously, the natural butchness of the oil rig. There you go. There's the weirdness of gender. And like, why have I gendered the oil rig? Where did that come from? I think, I mean, there's an interesting double bind to that. And again, this goes back to some of the things that actually the early gay and lesbian theatre was trying to look at and was trying to address. So one of the things that motivated Gay Sweatshop was actually the false apprehension that the theatre profession was necessarily friendly to gay people. So though there might be a lot of gay people around, there weren't very many openly gay people around, and also a lot of the theatre work they were being asked to participate in was producing quite stereotypical and derogatory images of gay people and of gay men and lesbians. So the idea that the theatre space had lots of gay people in it doesn't necessarily mean that space is an affirmative space, that is a productive space. Actually, it might require you to be closeted in all kinds of different ways. I mean, we might look now to the number of openly gay actors who are at the top of the profession, either in theatre or particularly in film and TV. There are, I mean, even allowing for the fact that non-heterosexual people make up probably a relatively small percentage of the population, it's a vanishingly tiny number of people who can claim to be top-ranked film stars who are also openly gay. It doesn't market well, I think, is the generically reductive argument that's given. So I think, yes, I think that there are some professions where people kind of go into them and there is a kind of cultural attachment to them, that there is this expectation that, if you work in the city, you work for a merchant bank, you need to present yourself in a certain kind of uniform way, and that turning up with multiple piercings and hair of a particular colour is not acceptable, and that there's a dress code which is written into the terms of your contract. But if you work for an indie art gallery, or for if you work for a gallery or an arts venue, that there is a different kind of cultural set of attachments which at work. Absolutely, I'd agree with that. I'm just very wary about fetishizing the alternative spaces as being therefore automatically affirmative. That you might find yourself the performance of your gender being constrained in a whole new and exciting set of ways. An argument that comes out in can I remember her name? I'll remember her name in a second, but a really interesting idea which comes about kind of compulsory queerness. In order to be queer, you must be continually dissenting, you must be continually trying to kind of shatter or break the norms of gender and sexuality, that you can't be kind of boringly queer. You always have to be threateningly and disruptively queer, and that compulsive queerness, that compulsion to be queer in a particular way, takes on the quality of a whole new norm. You must be radical, but you must be radical in these ways.
This speaks to a point that you already raised, right? Where what was at one point kind of disruptive depends in some ways on its other normal, the thing that it's disrupting. Yeah. And that those two things are always kind of in communication and in some ways in collusion with one another. If we think about it in binary terms like that, where you have the dominant and the disruptive, if we're thinking in binary terms like that. I have a question about the very boring, a question about the workplace. It's actually a great question. And it's one that I think, particularly as a woman in academia, I think about a lot. So the question is this: my PhD involves communication within the workplace. I'm interested to know your thoughts about why certain gender norms are adapted in different contexts. So, for example, women adopting more masculine traits to secure career progression and why some performative discursive enactments are valued or are perceived, and this is a really interesting phrasing, perceived to be more successful than others. This question of success, and I say this, speaking of clothing, very conscious of my jacket, my blazer, my professional clothing. So could you speak a little bit to the way that these performances relate to the question of labor and the workplace and success and value?
I guess I mean there are a few observations, some of which are kind of not my arguments, so really reflect, I guess, broader arguments made in feminist scholarship, which is that the standard for what constitutes success has, in many respects, stayed the same, and the pool of people allowed to take part in that success has broadened slightly. So the fact that more women or more people from a different range of class or ethnic backgrounds are allowed to take part in certain jobs hasn't really changed the determination of what success is in those circumstances. That would be my first thought. So that in order to kind of to succeed in what was once a conventionally male space still requires you to adopt traditionally male or masculine definitions of, or at least definitions which came about when the space was exclusively male. Yeah. And those have just remained the same, and they're perceived somehow to be neutral. They're not perceived to be gendered at all. And so and the clue that they are gendered perhaps is the degree to which fulfilling them requires you to perform yourself in a certain way, in a way which is like a man, to put it really crudely.
Well, or like a certain performance.
Yeah.
I remember being instructed in actually very clear and kind of frighteningly explicit terms when I started teaching that I needed to either be this kind of female in the classroom or this kind of female in the classroom, and that like this other thing you were doing just then isn't going to work for you quite. You probably shouldn't do that. Yeah. Right.
And I think that's an extraordinary thing that applies to kinds of. I'm trying to think what the hashtag is on Twitter. You see these great/horrifying discussions of this, and it is particularly the advice that comes out both from male academics, but also from more established female academics, which is advice given to younger women entering the profession about how to conduct themselves. And it is fiercely normative in all kinds of ways. But you do often see it somehow. You also see it in the feedback that you get from students. That students will make comments about their teachers who present as women that they would never ever think about their staff who present as men. And it's a bit unnerving sometimes that when you see the kind of comments come back, and they're not, thankfully, certainly in my job here, I've never had to do anything like deeply unpleasant, but there is a kind of tonal thing, there's a kind of commentary which is about somehow, which is about appearance actually. That reflects maybe a kind of, again, a wider culture that the value of female-bodied people is located there. Even though this is a professor, even though this is a person with a PhD standing in front of you, that person is also woman-bodied, and therefore we need to exert this other set of judgments. And it's strange that, speaking as someone who I'm kind of conscious that the advantage of my increasingly cisgendered presentation, I say increasingly cisgendered because I discovered the gym a couple of years ago and I have a different shaped body now, is genuinely, it's been so interesting and in a very dull way for everyone else, that my students do behave or respond to me in lecture spaces because I present and I appear like this in the way that I do. And that one of the decisions I've taken in teaching, and I spend a lot of time teaching gender and sexuality to undergraduate students, is to draw attention to the terms of my presentation which they kind of see as a default. So when I point out to them that I nearly always wear exactly the same thing in front of them, that I nearly always wear damn close to actually what I'm wearing today, actually, black t-shirt, blue trousers. And then I say, do you ever notice if I've shaved or not? And I noticed, do you like my choice of watch? Do I wear a watch when I'm lecturing, or you or not? And then we talk about what construction of maleness or masculinity do I present in front of them. So it's a bit of a risk sometimes, but I have stood in front of seminar groups and kind of gone, I need you to tell me what are the signs of Stephen. If this is a performative artifact in front of you, what am I doing to create the effect, the illusion that I'm actually here? It is a bit of a gamble, but also I think it's one that I'm in a position of relative security, so why not? I don't always do it, but why not?
I mean, to go back to this question about success, though, and value, I mean, some of what you seem to be saying is that not just that we are gendered and that we perform gender, but actually that value is gendered in some way by virtue of having been constructed discursively in a discursive place that was dominated by a certain performance of gender at a certain point in history. Oh,
absolutely. I mean, I would struggle. I'd be able to go away and find some references, but I think absolutely there are forms of labour which have been shown to be undervalued because they have been done historically by women, which, when men move into the exact same workspace, suddenly start being valued more highly. I don't know if any of you are sociologists, we could go away and find the case studies. They're kind of terrifyingly transparent, which shows that if you change the gender composition of the workforce, suddenly that workforce is considered to be essential and actually deserving of a higher wage. Structural sexism really isn't that subtle. It's like you can say what you like about structural sexism, but subtlety isn't one of its major problems. So yeah, no, I think it's the values that are associated are painfully transparent sometimes. There's yeah.
Does this relate to the way we value knowledge? I mean, which is supposed to be so abstract and kind of.
Yeah. Well, we can look at the relationship, maybe, or the standing of arts and humanities subjects in relationship to funding structures. We might also pay attention to the degree to which let's say the disproportionate or underfunding of certain areas of the arts and humanities have a disproportionate effect on women or people who present as women, because the vast majority of scholars in the arts and humanities, well, actually no, I won't say the vast majority, I think it is the majority, are women. The science and engineering is male dominated. So there are forms of knowledge which are populated differently according to gender, I think. And then when money follows certain kinds of knowledge production, because it has a certain kind of direct application, it does have broader effects in stabilizing particular kinds of value. We're then getting into really large sociological questions, which I have opinions about, but they're just that, they're opinions. I'm on the edge of my expertise, very much there.
Interesting that we talk about these issues of assets and how men and women are treated in the workplace. I wonder if you could comment on the issue of the perception of authenticity. You sometimes in debate, especially when things get very vituperative online, sometimes encounter people say you have no right to comment on this because you're not a man or because you're not a woman. I wonder what you view the implications of such authenticity paradigms as being, and to what extent does queer theory choose to draw on them, or perhaps try and dissociate itself?
Okay, so the question is about authenticity and the way in which authenticity claims serve to legitimate certain viewpoints or the legitimacy of various people even to speak. My approach has been, first of all, I think whenever we get into the claim of what is or isn't authentic, it feels like it always involves some kind of deferral of judgment. So that when we kind of go, this is the unified experience of being a man or being a woman, there is a certain level of, let's say, communal shared experience that I have with other male-bodied people, because I grew up in the same culture as them. But then immediately I'm starting to think about how my experience was inflected by my middle-classness, my whiteness, the fact that I went to a Catholic primary school. So as soon as I start to get into any kind of consequential difference, I'm like, which thread of that constitutes my authentic masculinity? So I always feel a little bit concerned about that, because I don't know where we draw the line, because that line always involves a kind of a performative rather than constative claim. Yeah, we're always having to draw a line in the sand somewhere. It doesn't mean that we don't have collective and communal experiences. It doesn't mean that we're not treated in a certain way because of our presentation, because we appear to be of a particular race, because we appear to be of a particular class, because we are of those races or those classes. But I struggle to know where we can productively draw the line. So my position, or the strategy I've tried to take, and I don't know it's always a successful one, has been to think about authentication rather than authenticity. So to think about the processes, the discourses, the context by which authenticity is achieved and claimed. Yeah. So you shift the center of attention from the kind of unchallengeable claim on the authentic. Yeah, because either the authentic is or isn't. Yeah, and you shift it to something which we can actually maybe have a conversation about, which is discourses of authentication. How are things verified? How are things made to seem real and true? Because that, to me, is more useful, because it tells you where the power lies. And it tells you, certainly in a kind of performative sense, which conventions or reiterative processes are at stake and are perhaps open to change. So, yeah, my interest has been to shift from the question of the authentic, which seems to be slightly unresolvable, to the question of authentication, which seems to be productively open to debate. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't worry, this is what I've been doing for the last half hour.
I'm just with that insight in slightly shifting it to work is more sculptural and it's more like dynamic on that. I'm very interested in your experience as a practitioner, where you're back with wanting to be expressing something that is contrived and that isn't necessarily by playfulness. So I'm just thinking about your experience as a practitioner in making work that is coming from a place of direct response and true whatever, true expression or direct experience that is performative, because it's lived, not playful in terms of being contrived.
So the question, again, for other people, so the question is the relationship between our lived experiences and what we might do as practitioners, and the degree to which they are sincere and or playful.
Yeah,
is that
almost things like that in modern to an artist is being an artist, being, I think you summed up better there.
But yeah, no, I think that
the artist is being authentic.
Yeah, the role of the artist as the kind of the figure of authenticity is I'm the kind of work that I've been involved in making has not ever really been I would say autobiographical in any kind of strong sense. Although some of the improvisational work that I've improvised, movement-based work that I've done, is probably the closest to that in terms of a kind of a process of, I guess, somatic expression, although it's not verbalized. I think there is a hearty tradition of solo autobiographical performance, and this is partly what I'm trying to write about in the current book that I'm working on, in which suffering serves to authenticate the content of the artistic experience, and that sits within, I think, a far broader tradition of what we think martyrs and saints are. So I think I am more interested, both as a practitioner and as a researcher, is work which acknowledges and plays with those conventions. So I've spent the last few weeks writing about the work of a performer called Adrian Howes, who was based here in Glasgow up until a couple of years ago, unfortunately, when he died. And he was a creative fellow, actually, in theatre studies up until a few years ago. And he produced this piece of work called the 14 Stations of Adrian House. And it's a piece of work which is this autobiographical promenade piece, which is structured very loosely along the kind of the 14 Stations of the Cross. So these are the 14 stations, the kind of the biblical narrative. It's the Passion of the Christ. Yeah. So it's the suffering and pain of Christ going from his trial up the hill to Golgotha, the place of the skull, his crucifixion, his entombment, and his resurrection. Yeah, so a nice, light thematic structure to work with, and it's a work where, on the one hand, it's kind of painfully autobiographical. It involves these disclosures of these really painful moments in his life. Not only how he was badly treated by other people, but also like what he sees as his own failings, like his own narcissism, his own selfishness. And there's a couple of moments in it which are so. They're really interesting because you're really not sure what he was trying to intend, and I think the indeterminacy is exactly the effect. So that he kind of forces himself to cry and makes you watch him cry. And there's a couple of really interesting kind of responses to this that people have written, kind of journal articles who saw the work, who talk about it in terms of like not feeling anything at all. And kind of having the opposite reaction to this. You know, this was clearly a real emotional experience he once had, but it's now being restaged and forced for us. And I feel really awkward that I feel like I'm supposed to owe you something in this outpouring of emotion, and I don't feel anything at all, and I kind of want it to be over. So I think that I'm really interested in those kinds of moments. There's a lovely term which I like. It's always good when you learn new words. Such a nerd. Extimacy. Extimacy, so the exteriorization of intimacy. And it's kind of thought about in terms of this experience which is void of emotion, actually. It's all on the outside, there's nothing on the inside. And I think that sometimes that queer performance is particularly interested in that, of playing with the emotional stakes of real experience. There is absolutely a big, a huge body, huge tradition of queer work in which autobiographical material is put to work in service of truth claims, and importantly and valuably done. You know, I think it's very important that those works exist and continue to exist. I'm slightly more interested in this work which takes that convention and starts to kind of play with our expectations of it. And in the case of that work, the 14 Stations of Adrian House, serves to kind of challenges you to think as a participant in that work about what kind of responsibility or attachment you have to another person. When you see another person suffering, what does that response supposed to involve? You know, the instant I'm supposed to be empathetic question. So there's something interesting about what's the morality of that exchange. So that's slightly apart from your question, but that's what's immediately in my head.
I'm interested in the fact that by witnessing that you are aware of an experience that was authentic.
Yeah.
Whether you're experiencing it and watching it, you're still
yeah. Because, I mean, the idea of I should say that the 14 Stations work was a one-to-one performance, so it's just you and him. So, and this is like one of the qualities of the witness. The witness is a privileged observer. So you've seen something that not many people, or perhaps no one else has seen, and that possibly, as a consequence, there is an imperative that you will tell other people. That's the quality of the witness. And again, I think that's part of the framework of the work as a one-to-one show, is that it exploits the fact that you are there by yourself.
It's so interesting in the I'm sorry, I'm just going to follow a little bit. It's so interesting in the context of performance. If we take performance out of live theater and put it, say, on television or on film, where we register authenticity as like a sign of the actor's craft or art, depending on how you see it, right? But we know. I mean, the whole game is that you're pretending to do this, that you're pretending to cry, and the way we play it is to say, how well are you convincing me that what you're doing is real? And that's how we talk about it, isn't it? When we talk about like really virtuosic performance in film or
and it's also the performance of realness in really specific territories. So this is partly to do with like the default setting of naturalism and realism, which we don't pay much attention to, this iconicity thing, where we do the staggering thing of casting the part of the old woman with a woman who happens to be old, and casting the part of the attractive young woman with an actor who happens to be an attractive young woman. And that no one ever, you rarely kind of walk out of a piece of theatre and kind of going, yeah, that guy playing the young guy, I think he did being a young guy really well. There's a bit of the performance we're not paying attention to. That's not part of our judgment on the authenticity of it. Their young male bodiedness or their old woman bodiedness is just, that's like, well done. You've occupied your body successfully wearing a costume for an hour. It's a good definition of acting, actually. You've successfully occupied your body wearing your non-standard clothing for an hour. But yeah, I think that I mean, it's slightly a kind of it speaks to the dominance of naturalism and realism as the default setting for most of our entertainment. Which again is, I don't particularly, not suggesting it's a terrible or an excellent thing. It's just the default setting, which has consequences. But yeah.
Although we do say that people do a very good job when they inhabit somebody that we assume is not their real one for an hour or whatever. You played the old man very well, you might say, as a young actor,
yeah.
Or you played, again, gender.
Yeah, and I think and it suddenly becomes that's what's exceptional. That's what's we get to see the intricacy of the craft of the rubber mask that's been applied, the wig that's gone on. There's a video that's going around online at the moment, which is Robin Williams doing the screen test stuff for his appearance in Mrs. Doubtfire, which I can recommend for you because of his as the kind of the test footage goes on, his negotiation with the makeup and his voice as well, where he tries to work out how English or how Scottish she should be. So something quite interesting about someone developing the drag performance that they will occupy in the film on the fly. So it's really interesting because it's live as opposed to it's live in a different way than the presentation in the film, which is carefully edited, constructed. The performance by that point has been stabilised to render the character of Mrs. Doubtfire, and discreetly from that, I can't remember what the other character's called, but the husband character. In the test footage, it's Robin Williams blurring in and out of Mrs. Doubtfire. And there's something much more interesting about that. You could watch that for a couple of hours, actually.
So I have actually, if there's other questions or comments from the room, now is the time. I have two comments from the board. I think in closing, and one is to return to this question of work and labor and the way that expectations fit into a kind of a workplace setting and into a situation where actually it's not just a question of we're actually earning our keep in some way here. Mm-hmm. There are certain everyday stakes in this way, and it's about the kind of inability to kind of get it right for anyone who exceeds a certain conventional setting, and this is to return to the question specifically of gender, that there's a kind of a way of performing. In this case, the question is about masculinity in fields previously or still dominated by men, and that anyone who doesn't kind of perform that can't win, which is to say, gets to keep making lower wages or gets to keep. Mm-hmm. But is there some way in which what we should be saying is that none of us ever perform that? Is that an implication?
I think that is one of the kind of broader implications, or I think it's in some places an explicit argument that Butler makes, is that none of us are ever occupy fully the ideal of what it is to be a masculine man or a feminine woman. That even if we're doing it really well, we do it in a culture which is telling us we're not doing it quite right yet. There is a literal industry of we can go shopping now for magazines for men and for women, much worse for women than for men, but nonetheless a publishing industry which is full of very good advice on how to be better at being the stuff that you're supposed to be able to do naturally by default. So there is a gendered there is a kind of cultural industry which is about telling us how to do our gender properly, which suggests which has directed the most kind of successful instances of men and women, which is, I think, very, very interesting. I think possibly we need a few more magazines which are less paranoid, which are not telling you you're doing it wrong, but telling you, which suggest new ways that you might like to try doing it right. This is mainly the reason I'm not the editor of any women's magazines yet.
I have finally an anecdote from the oil rig, which is
okay.
I live in Aberdeen, and one of my close gay friends works offshore. He lives a completely binary life with two different, entirely different personas, one for home and one for work. So not only might we all be interestingly different and non-normative, but we can be multiple, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of maybe the ambition of the trajectory of queer theory, this idea that of the extending the range of lives which are livable. Now, I'm always really conscious whenever I teach or whenever I speak about the choice of my language, and that the continued reiteration today of male, masculine, female, feminine, is I'm always worried that. Well, not worried, concerned that it might represent a kind of foreclosure of the whole range of kind of gendered bodies which have no interest or no part in those terms. And that similarly, when I refer to gay and lesbian, that I always kind of am mentally appending gay and lesbian and bisexual and transgender and asexual and queer, and that we are sometimes in a struggle with terms of reference to talk about this material in a way which is actually genuinely expansive, which isn't just a rote listing of all of those kind of categories, so I can show I am properly liberal and inclusive and I am good, but to actually for that to be part of a meaningful extension of the possibilities of being human. And I think you just have to. My attempt is just to keep attempting it. In truth, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, and thank all of you for your questions and your comments. All of you out there in the ether for your questions and comments. And yes, we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.